Welcome to the RideShare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
All right. Emil Michael is a strategic investor and advisor currently serving as the CEO of the blank check company DPCM Capital. From 2013 to 2017, Emil was chief business officer at Uber, where he led the company through a period of exponential growth. Across his many tech leadership roles, Emil has been instrumental in the raise of $25 billion in capital, the creation of $100 billion in value for technology businesses. And today, Emil is focused on facilitating private transactions and public market access for technology companies and sharing his expertise with entrepreneurs on a larger scale. I'm excited to have him on the podcast. How are you doing today, Emil?
Great day here in Miami Beach, and good to connect with you after all the years of following you on Twitter and so on.
Yeah, it's always probably even more fun too when you're not working at Uber to chat with me, because then we can let her rip and have some fun, and it's sort of less in the thick of it and more recapping the fun of it, right?
Yeah, that's good. We both can have outsider perspectives, which will be fun to chat about.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think for me, it's always been fun because I've obviously never worked at Uber, but, friends with many people, especially now that they aren't at the company, and, interact with, hundreds of, if not thousands of people over the years. So you're someone that actually, we've never met until today. So I'm excited to have a fun conversation. And, so obviously when I teased you coming on the show on Twitter and LinkedIn, there's a lot of interest and excitement, a lot of comments that I saw. And then I also got a lot of private texts, emails, and tweets, all good, not bad, don't worry. But I'm curious to know, why do you think people are so excited to hear from you? Or, if you meet someone on the street or at a conference, what do they ask you? What do they want to know from you?
I think that Uber was in its heyday such a phenomenon, such a lightning in a bottle type of company, because the product market fit was insanely good from day one, right? The notion of pushing a button and getting a ride was revolutionary, and it was sort of, if you ask anybody about their first Uber ride, they're like, it was magic. That, and then combined with the growth trajectory we took, which was a global from day one, hyper ambitious company, and that grew from 100 people to 20,000 in 4 years. The world had never seen something like that. So when I meet people, or they're excited to hear from me, it's usually that they want to see, what was that like? I want my company to do that too. What are some pitfalls? What are some lessons? And then also, because of the ending of our tenure there, that was also, interesting. Books and TV shows about it. So there's lots to talk about depending on the person.
Yeah. Interesting. A bit messy, I guess you could say, in a way, right? I guess one thing on that note, though, do you think Uber was sort of a 1 in a million company? Because I feel like, obviously, there's been a whole wave of startups, Uber for X, and it's kind of even led, on the, sort of a revolution on the tech side. I'm sure a lot of founders have convinced employees, to come and join on board. Hey, we could be the next Uber. I guess, looking back, I know in my experience, and now having worked with a lot of companies in the food delivery and the scooter side and instant delivery, we keep seeing these comparisons to Uber, but I don't see any companies coming close really to Uber on a lot of those metrics that you talked about, whether it was growth or product market fit. I feel like, man, I almost feel personally lucky in a way that I was there to witness this, because I don't think it's ever going to happen again in my lifetime in that respect. How do you think about it?
Well, I think the thing that made Uber unique was it was one of the first tech companies that had an online presence that caused offline activity. Yeah. Right. You pushed a button and a physical car came and it did something for you. And interestingly enough, Uber didn't work really until the iPhone 2 came out, because the battery couldn't stay charged in the driver's car. So it needed a bigger battery. So we were literally on the front end of using iPhone and smartphones for commerce. And then we made it do something in the real world. And that opened up this universe of quick commerce and all these delivery things. So I do think it was one of a kind. And but Airbnb was also started around the same time and had a real world impact. And I never say never. I always think that there's always going to be some company that changes the landscape in some way.
Yeah, well, I think the big difference for me too, and especially now that we're working with startups, one thing that I always tell a lot of startups I'm working with is, look for that 180, that 180-degree difference, right? Like taxis were, pretty, I think, well agreed upon, terrible experience. Uber came along and was a great experience. So it wasn't like you were taking something good and making it better. It was you were taking something bad and making it great, right? Like hotels versus Airbnb. I mean, there were a lot of great hotels before Airbnb. Airbnb came along and served specific use cases. So I do think that you're onto something there with Uber. And I guess like the more I see and the more I think about it, it's like, man, I feel like Uber was a once in a lifetime kind of opportunity that we're now all reaping the benefits. And it is funny because obviously we'll talk about, Uber has been a bit shaky over the past couple of years, on the product side and the driver side. And it is funny, when you see people complaining about Uber or the reliability now, it's like we've gotten so jaded and so used to the ease of taking Uber. If it doesn't work perfectly, like, it's like, wow, this is a real first world problem now, huh?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that it was it was an almost universal problem.
Yeah.
Like if you ask anyone, not just in the US, but in any big city around the world, no one loved the taxi system.
Mm-hmm.
It was always designed not for the user. It was designed for the license owner or the taxi cab company, and not ever for the user or the driver, really. It's not like drivers were thriving under the New York City taxi regime either. So you're right. It had that sort of emotional impact for people almost universally around the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, and like with any, polarizing product, I mean, not everybody loved it. I started reaching out to you because I was really interested to have you on and chat about Super Pumped. You did a great interview on Call-In with Antonio Garcia Martinez that, to be honest, like covered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask you. So I'm going to put a link in the show notes. People can just go listen to him interview you for like a full breakdown of your thoughts on Super Pumped. I thought that was really good. But I'm just curious, like, what was it like to see yourself on TV? Because I think obviously, Super Pumped, I think, well, you let me know what you think, but it definitely, touched on some of the, the negative sides of what Uber had done over the years, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird, definitely, and worrisome. You're like, well, I've never met this actor. I don't know what the script is. What's he going to say? How much license?
He kind of looks like you now that I'm looking at you in video. Maybe a little younger, no offense, but I see elements. Like a young Emil is how I see him.
He's younger. He's better, better looking, and he was dressed more suave than I was.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely weird. I was more worried because you didn't know how these things get portrayed.
Yeah.
But it was so over the top and so sort of incorrect in so many ways that it was sort of comical ultimately.
Yeah.
Like the whole video game sequences were were odd and all that. But yeah, it's cool that someday I'll tell my kids like, hey, there was this TV show and I was a character in it. And they'll say, well, Dad, what really happened? And I'll tell them. So in that way, it's kind of cool. And I'll look back on it more fondly, I think, over time.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I think personally, I wasn't the biggest fan of the show. I ended up watching throughout the series. I just didn't, it wasn't my cup of tea. And if it wasn't my job to watch it, I probably wouldn't have watched the whole show. Let's just put it that way. And I mean, I don't think that it, ended up becoming, sort of a pop culture hit and tons of people watched, to be frank. So I sort of will leave it at that.
Yeah. I think something like 80,000 households watched the finale. So really, really niche-y. And yeah.
If there was a show to be made about Uber where you had the ability to sort of, put your stamp on it or, work on it, or executive producer, I think is the title in Hollywood that a lot of folks like, what would you do differently? Or, what would you kind of want to portray that, obviously I think that, kind of highlights both the good and the bad about Uber during that time that you were there?
I mean, there might be something happening. Who knows, right? I'll tease that a little bit, but
well, if you have some announcements right now to break, feel free to let it rip, Emil.
Yeah, no announcements just yet. But I think the thing that I would want to show is like the incredible enthusiasm of the employees who were there early on, and the sort of the ambitious mentality of everyone about how excited they were to be working at a company that was literally making people's lives better, reducing DUIs, taking people to the hospital to have their babies. I mean, getting to the airport on time. Not like, it was solving so many problems. That didn't mean it didn't create others.
Yep.
But the notion of being a missionary at that company during those years was really exciting, and everyone who worked there during that time is chasing that high still in a way.
Yeah.
And there were some great people, and obviously, I know Travis very well. He's probably one of the best entrepreneurs of our era, and I don't think that show did him justice. And I want to make sure that the people who really built the company and did good things were showing the good side of them, not just the bad side.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely fair. I think obviously a lot of good has come out. And I think there are a number of articles and stories and interviews we've heard. And, just frankly, like all the success that especially the early employees, but even, from top 500, top 1,000, top 20,000, folks have gone on to start companies, start funds, and do some cool things. So I definitely feel like there's a pretty positive, lasting legacy from Uber there. But obviously it wasn't all good. Do you think what was one of the more valid criticisms of Uber? Or what's something you think that was kind of fair from either the show or your tenure there?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the lessons I learned is there's two different things. You grow a business and then you grow a company. There's sort of two different things. Business is your revenue and your sort of market share. And then the company building is, HR, legal, finance, manager training, reviews, sort of learning how to be a leader. And the company was so young. I think in the early days, the average age was 25.
Yeah.
And you're spread all over the world at the hottest company that ever existed, with tons of money and ambition. And with the business growth, I just wish we did enough. We did company growing too, right? And if you build the infrastructure for a company as it's growing, it's going to be more resilient. You'll make fewer mistakes. But it'd never been done before, so we didn't quite know. No one really knew how to do that. But I think if I were telling a startup founder today who's in hyper growth, I'd say you cannot not pay attention to the company building element here. And that means all the constituents, all the guardrails, and those kinds of things.
Well, I guess what's the inflection point where you sort of need to consider that? Because I'd love to hear your take, because I feel like, obviously a lot of people have criticized Travis, and, I think the show maybe highlighted, more of his negative attributes than his positive, kind of like you said. But I actually always, I don't have a personal opinion, but, and I've actually never met Travis, but I always felt like his attitude, if he didn't have that attitude, RideShare and Uber never would have worked, right? If he would have gone, hat in hand to regulators, they would have said, hey, go F yourself, get out of my office, right? Which is kind of, I think, what happened. And so it's sort of you needed that type of attitude. I'm very confident you needed that type of attitude to make Uber work, but then, it's hard to turn that off, right? So it's how do you turn that off? Or what's the inflection point where it's you go from high growth to, slowing some of that down? Because I think that sort of seems I think one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah. I mean, well, look, I think there's a few separate things there. So number one, you're absolutely right that you needed a missionary to knock down these barriers. These barriers have been there for decades. They're controlled by a small group of people. They had symbiosis with the political machine in these cities. And there was no being nice guy. And even today, after 5 years of a more nice guy approach by Dara, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Spain, Italy are still essentially closed to true ride sharing. So the nice guy thing didn't work. And Uber got the supply cap in New York after, when they tried a nice guy approach. So I think this business is just gritty, right? That's separate from company building. So when you're company building, I think if we made the turn in 2015 or 16, when you started to have over 10,000 employees, and you started to not be able to remotely know everyone who was working at the company, you had to put these things in place so that the important problems and opportunities bubbled up in the right way. And in terms of the attitude of just being pirates, I think yes, at some point you have to be sort of a little bit more diplomatic, let's say. But you can't be too diplomatic in your business, or you get your butt kicked, like Uber's getting their butt kicked now,
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think it's more about the board? Because obviously Uber had, I think, from the outside at least, seemed like they had a pretty good board. Is it about hiring the right executives who will sort of listen to you? I mean, I think Super Pump to me, obviously portrayed you as kind of the right-hand man to Travis and sort of making a lot of the tough decisions together. And I think that was accurate, but I'll let you share. It sort of seemed like you guys had a pretty strong bond there. And like, I don't know that I've never been in a meeting with the two of you, but it seemed to me like, if Travis said something that you didn't like and you spoke up, he would consider that feedback.
Yeah, I mean, he and I had a very close relationship. I was definitely in the room in the hard decision times.
Yeah.
Even though my organization was relatively small, out of the 20,000, I had probably 300 people reporting to me. But I had outsized influence just because we thought the same way in a lot of ways, and then we thought different in other ways, and he appreciated that debate. And it was a little bit of the, hey, look, we just had this, I had this philosophy, which happened to work for me, which is I criticized in private, not in public.
Yeah.
And sometimes his brain works so fast that, I had to catch up. So I didn't want to comment in the moment. I wanted to sort of understand where he's coming from because he had a vision. But yes, the problem today is both the board and the management team. The management team, what you're supposed to have is a board that holds a management team accountable.
Yeah.
And a management team that has to perform. And right now you've got neither of the two. So one could argue reasonably so that in the Travis and Emil days, you should have had a board that had more influence and control. And that's probably true, right?
Yeah.
It would have kept the rails on a little bit more. But now it's sort of the opposite. It's sort of just entrenched.
Yeah. So, it's funny. You mentioned 5 years, right? You left Uber in 2017, and that is actually 5 years ago. It seems like, I don't know, it seems like doesn't seem like that long ago, but 5 years is a long time, huh?
Yeah. I was there for 4 years. I've been gone for 5. So it's definitely receding in terms of its proportion by life, right?
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned this sort of nice guy approach that, I think obviously Uber brought in Dara to sort of steer, right the ship and, sort of like make friends, make amends, kind of like you said. I think that was pretty well documented. How would you assess their performance over the past 5 years? I mean, I guess if you look at, market share, for example, like I think if anything, during the pandemic, they've increased their market share a little bit relative to Lyft when it comes to rides. I know you've been pretty outspoken on the food delivery side, but, high level, either give them a grade or give them sort of, what do you think about their performance over the past 5 years?
Yeah, well, I think initially the company did need what Dara had, which is a calming influence, a diplomatic approach, and those things are really important in that chaotic year and a half after we left. But after that, there's sort of Uber hadn't won. It was still a wartime company in a wartime industry, in food delivery and rides. Like none of these battles had sort of been settled. So that approach, I think, sort of lost its luster.
Well, yes, I mean, at that time, Uber did have market share lead versus Lyft. I guess internationally, they were sort of starting to recede and sell off some of the business units, like, like in China, obviously, and Yandex in Russia, right? Do you mean more in food delivery side or rides?
No, what I mean is in rides in Latin America, in food delivery in Latin America, in rides in India, rides in the EU. Now you have a lot of competitors who are getting to Lyft size in those regions. And then you have the whole Doordash flip in market share, which was a $20-30 billion issue. So that was a big loss. Yeah. At this point, the stock is giving you the grade. It's half the IPO price. Yeah. And, if the NASDAQ and S&P 500 are up 50% and Uber's down 40%, that's a 90-point gap. That's a D.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's so you give them a D. Is that the grade?
Yeah. Sadly, I'm a shareholder, so I don't like I wish it was an A, but it's a D.
Got it. Do you still have a large percent of your net worth in shares of Uber?
Yeah, I am quite sure I have more shares than Dara has, so I care a lot about having it be a successful company. I have a lot of friends who work there, as you know, over the years, who I've tried to support and so on. So I care about every one of their shareholdings because it was life-changing for a lot of us and a lot of them. So it's disappointing where the company's at now.
Is it tough being, as a large shareholder, is it tough being on the outside? And I mean, obviously you can talk to people at the company and you can, do interviews and, sort of advise. I guess that's sort of the best thing about being an advisor or a consultant. You can tell people what to do, but they don't always listen to you and you can't always get your hands dirty. So some good, some bad. But, what's it feel like to sort of be in that position? Because I think that's somewhat unique to obviously your role, with Uber and maybe even at other companies that you work with.
Yeah. Well, as it relates to Uber, in the first year or two, yes, you had this sense of like, I can't do anything about what was happening, but not anymore. Now I'm just a shareholder who sort of understands the business better than most and wants it to succeed.
Yeah.
And the culture that they have there is not a culture that I would enjoy managing or being a part of. So I don't have any desire to go dig, roll my sleeves up, nor would I be welcome to do that. But that being said, I wish they listen more to advice from the outside on obvious things.
What are some of those obvious things? Because I actually, I sort of agree with a lot of what you're saying here. I mean, I think Dara was a good calming presence. I think he was the right man for the job early on. And, I've interviewed him a couple of times. I've met him in person. I like him a lot. I was actually pretty impressed with, sort of his knowledge of the business, especially on the driver's side, since I know he's covering many different things. But if you look objectively, for example, at the stock price, I think it's basically impossible to agree. I mean, they literally underperformed the market by a large margin, right? And I don't think actually, even though I like Dara and have good personal feelings about his, him as a person, like I think objectively, if you look at it, like he hasn't done that well as the CEO of the company if they're underperforming the market, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not people say it's macro. You're like, okay, well then chart S&P or NASDAQ
and compare to Uber stock price, right?
Yeah, so it's not macro. And they're like, well, we're the leader in our industry. I was like, yes, but being the leader in the industry means you should dictate, or you have a big influence on how Wall Street views this industry, right? If you're not making profits, they're going to assume no one else is. So I think, some of the obvious things were just being asleep at the wheel at the market share losses. That's sort of unforgivable. And then number two, the
and rides internationally, food, or both?
Food more than anything.
Yeah.
Because Uber was ahead almost everywhere. And now they're behind in Mexico, out of Brazil, behind in US, neck and neck in EU. So that was a big kind of loss.
Why do you think that happened? Because I mean, obviously, I think DoorDash has gotten a lot of positive press around, especially in tech and investor media, around how great of an operator Tony is. And I think the story has been more about how great DoorDash is and less about how poorly, Uber Eats has executed. Why do you think it is that DoorDash, in your opinion, do you agree with that narrative, or why was DoorDash able to take such large market share in the US, for example?
They did a couple of things fast that Uber lagged, which was going to the suburbs. And the over-the-top model, which is, getting restaurants on the platform before you signed up, so that when a user opened the app, they had a wide variety of options. And variety, it turns out, is the killer retention aspect in food delivery. You want to open the app and have a lot of options. And DoorDash figured that out and did it very quickly. And then third, they also did Dash Pass very early. So they created this loyalty sort of mechanism in there, much like Amazon Prime. They did all those innovations faster. And if you're 1, 2, 3 years behind those things, you're just behind, right?
Well, and it's interesting because I mean, everything you described is easy to copy, but it seems like that first mover advantage, right? Like I think it's the same reason why, Uber on the ride side has held such a market share advantage for so long. I mean, Lyft, Juno, other companies have come in and tried to copy that model. Juno undercut Uber in New York City, but once the subsidies went away, everyone went back to Uber. Why was that? I'm guessing it was because they were first and people got used to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, rideshare has a different dynamic than food delivery in that the more dense your supply is in a city of drivers, the more reliable and therefore cheaper. That flywheel still sort of works. So that's why we invested heavily in getting the lead and keeping the lead, knowing that that was going to stick. And I do think the market architecture is not 100 to 0. It's not winner take all. It's more like 75-25. Or 50-50, it's sort of like it's either going to be dominant or one. So I think that's why you'll see Uber sort of continue to be where it is and slightly better in the US. The thing I do worry about is Bolt and Yassir, the companies in EU and Africa who have a fundamentally lower cost structure, and they could do 10% commissions to drivers and have just built a company around 10%. That could be a game changer because it's hard for Uber to compete with that kind of price model.
Got it. Do you think Uber could lose its market share on the ride side in the US?
I don't think so. I think the US is pretty solid in terms of 75-25 on average. It'll flip a point or two here or there, but it's going to be pretty solid. People like a brand choice. Like there are people who just like the brand ethic of Lyft, and that'll always be there. But they have the same labor costs. They have the same, very similar insurance costs, very similar sorts of things. So there's no catalyst where I could see Lyft getting to a majority of the market.
I mean, you mentioned the commission, for example, and so this would be in international markets with rideshare companies that are competing with Uber just on a lower commission. How do you see that? I mean, I guess like when I hear, for example, right, like understand on the driver side, people, drivers want to be paid more, they want lower commission, they want these things. So it's easy, I think, to market those things to drivers. But like, how can a rideshare company internationally just have a lower commission? What are the physical costs? Is it less on insurance? Is it less on marketing? Like, what are the unit economics breakdown that would allow a competitor internationally to beat Uber on the ride side?
Yeah, I mean, they have lower sales SG&A basically. Like I think the Bolt company is based in Estonia, and so their engineers and their executives are built there. So salaries and those things, and then they probably do clever, like they didn't have to build the app from scratch. By the time Uber had built their app, they could sort of more simply build it. It was just easier to build later. So their R&D.
I mean, they can basically let Uber figure everything out and copy them, right?
It's sort of how Lyft drafted behind Uber on regulations.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like they were leading it. Uber spent the money and did the expertise, and then they followed. And in rideshare and these other markets, you can do it cheaper because you're just starting cheaper and you have less overhead.
Yeah. I mean, on the regulatory side, I remember Lyft actually working with Uber a lot, when it came to like when the companies pulled out of Austin and, airport regulations and things like that. What do you see, Lyft's role in the rideshare picture in the US right now? Do you kind of see them sticking around that 25 to 30% market share? And how do you feel about them as a competitor? Because especially in the past few months, I know that they've been kind of hammered by investors and, kind of a lot of people piling up on them.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe it gets to 20% market share. But the reason I think Uber gained market share during the pandemic is because of the massive driver shortage. What happened is if you open both apps, since Uber is bigger, just naturally had better wait times. And therefore, people who used both started just using Uber, and it just became habitual. So this supply shortage advantaged Uber. So when things normalize, I don't know what happens. Maybe Lyft gains a couple market share points back, but it's a tough business for both of these companies. Lyft has less optionality, less diversity of revenue stream, less geographic diversity. So it may end up being just sort of the one that hangs out at 20%, 25% for a while at a $5 billion market cap, which is less than the total amount of venture capital they raised.
Yeah, not great. How important do you think drivers are to this equation? I mean, whether you realize or not, you are on a driver's podcast right now, and that's the business that I'm in. So I'm a bit partial, but I'm curious, sort of like looking at it objectively, like how do you think drivers fit into this equation?
I mean, the myth about when Travis and I were running through is that we didn't care about drivers. It was the driver need base was changing every year in a big way. It started with the full-time black car driver, who then came over, who then sort of saw Uber as an income filler when they didn't have clients by the hour or whatever. And then they transitioned over because it was so good and the prices were high and there was a lot of demand. And then when UberX launched, it competed with Uber Black. So you were sort of, and if I were a black car driver, I'd be mad too. You're like, hey, you introduced this low price product. People are now opting to do that, so they lost business. So that means either their price had to come down or something. So it was really hard to know what to do to grow the business and do right by the drivers. One of the first things I did when I joined Uber is create a driver loyalty program. And we built sort of all these discounts that drivers would get, whether it was grocery. We did same day pay with Green Dot when I was there.
I think that launched in 2016. Instant Pay, probably one of the most popular driver features ever released, for sure.
And we're the first ride-sharing company in the world to do it, right? So we were focused on it, but it was changing. And that now 80% of drivers driving less than 10 hours a week. It's a totally different driver base than it was even 5 years ago. So what I think is, the one thing I struggle with, I guess, is giving the driver the destination ahead of time and what that does to the user experience. I worry about, because that creates a problem for the whole marketplace, which I think ends up hurting drivers and riders. But I'm interested in your opinion on that.
I mean, Uber is pushing this pretty hard in California. As long as you accept 5 out of the last 10 requests, for example, as a driver, you can see the destination of where the passenger is going. And then in, I think, 20 markets, they're piloting this across the rest of the country. And I think if you ask drivers, they love this because they get to see where they're going and when they're going. I think this is a really, maybe an inherent tension between Uber and the drivers that I'd love to ask you about, because when you think about what drivers want, they kind of want as few drivers on the road as possible, as much surge as possible. And the companies kind of want the opposite, right? So as a driver, I want to know where every rider is going. But then as a driver, I'm also naturally going to cherry pick the best rides, and the service becomes more unreliable at an aggregate level, but on an individual level, I'm benefiting. So how do you sort of balance the two narratives? Like, I think this is something Uber has really struggled with. Like, what do drivers care about on an individual level versus like, hey, if you keep doing that and cherry picking all the rides, eventually people aren't going to take Uber and then there aren't going to be enough rides for you. But that's like a future issue. I got $50 that I need to make today, and I'm going to cash out instantly with Emil's product that you launched in 2016 and pay my bills, right? That's what I care about today. I don't care about the future. So how do you reconcile those two?
It's a classic collective action problem where for me, it's one thing versus collectively, it may be hurting the collective. I think that there just has to be, some balance, and not every issue has to be balanced, but on balance, a driver needs to be satisfied with what they're making and the effort required to make it, and have it feel like they're being fairly treated and listened to. And ultimately, that's going to require some economic sacrifice on Uber's part, but it's also going to require some sacrifice on some of these featurey things that drivers want, or else the whole system doesn't work. And the other problem is, because drivers churn so much, it's not like you're satisfying drivers and therefore they stay. They're churning because they're doing this as an income gap filler for most of them, not for a full-time job. So I have the most sympathy for the drivers who are doing this for their main income source. And is there a distinction? Maybe you could treat that category of driver with different benefits and different features than the casual driver. I don't know. That's an idea. But I haven't been in the game long enough to see. But I will tell you this taxi thing they're doing is a big mistake. It hurts drivers. It hurts riders. Sorry?
Why is that?
It's one of the dumbest moves I've ever seen. I think Mac, who I actually thought was quite good, he said it was like the most bold thing Uber's ever done. Number one, taxi competes with Uber drivers. So that's like hurting the Uber driver who we're supposed to be making more money from.
It goes back to, right, like if there's more supply, right, if you add taxi drivers to the supply, one of our most popular videos on YouTube right now is actually, does Uber have an oversupply of drivers, in certain markets right now? So I think that's one worry for Uber drivers, right?
Yeah. And then what happens in times of surge, if you open the app and the taxi's way cheaper because they have fixed price? Then that business will go there and drivers don't get surge. So the problem will compound on drivers.
Well, in a time right now, I like the move in a time right now where Uber has this driver supply shortage, right? Because obviously taxis, they typically have a little bit of a higher base rate than Uber. So, if there are times where Uber is surging, that's actually more expensive than taxis' base rate, right? And so taxis can kind of come in and maybe even make more than they normally do. And, but you're right, it does obviously impact the market and will have a negative effect on drivers' earnings for sure.
And we tried this in 2012 because there was a company, Halo, that did taxi hailing. We're like, oh, maybe we're missing something. consumers hated it. There's a reason why consumers use Uber and Lyft, is they hated the taxi experience. And the drivers who are doing, they're not bad people, but the system that's designed for them does not encourage them to be great at what they do and act in an Uber-like way with ratings and all these things. So it might be a short-term fix, but it's a strategic error. And then if you do it in the countries that don't have true ride sharing, like Italy and all these other countries, you actually take the pressure off the politicians to actually consider and pass ride sharing legislation. So it's sort of like, they're like, oh, what are you talking about? We're working with Uber. And it's not really Uber. There's no ride sharing.
Well, one of the big complaints that I've heard on the consumer side, since 2012, I mean, I was a driver in 2014 and providing water, and, rates were quite a bit higher and making more money as a driver, is that the quality of Ubers have gone down over time, especially I think internationally, this is true, but, even in the US, right, the quality of that, there's a lot of talk that Uber has churned through, millions of drivers, and it's sort of like, who's left to drive? And so I think that's one of the arguments, I've seen, that basically people say the quality has gone down. So now, if I can get a ride from a taxi, but it's at a lower ETA or a lower price than Uber might be, right now, then that actually is a benefit. And I kind of actually agree with that, like, I think really what I've seen is like 90% of people really want to get from A to B in sort of the fastest, most reliable, cheapest way. And as long as a lot of the other stuff is somewhat the same, I don't think they really will care if it's in a taxi or if it's in an Uber. What do you think?
I disagree. I mean, I think what happens with taxi, remember, if you take an Uber and it calls a taxi, and the taxi sees a hail on the street with their hands raised and they're going to get paid cash, they're going to cancel. That's just what's happened. That's why people hated the system. And then you don't have the controls.
Well, that's also not, I mean, on the product side, it's not the hardest to build that in, right? If you have a certain cancellation rate, you no longer are available for Uber requests as a taxi driver, right?
Yes, but that depends on the negotiation you have with the taxi and limousine commissions. Are they going to let you take drivers off the system?
Gotcha.
Or are you going to have to adjudicate it? Or how?
So it sounds like you're worried that like taxis coming on will bring a lot of those negative aspects, that have historically plagued taxis, the experience onto the Uber platform.
For sure. And you blame Uber because you ordered the taxi through Uber. That's just how it works. And there's no benefit. It's not like they're making the big commission rates that they do with Uber drivers. It makes sense in no respect, in my view. And frankly, the algorithm doesn't seem to be working well. Like in that, if you have a driver shortage, rates should go up and drivers should make more. And in theory, that should get more drivers on the road, and it comes to some balance. If you start doing artificial things like adding taxi in there, the whole pricing mechanism gets weird and squirrely. So I just don't understand the logic of it. And then remember, in New York City, you probably have 60,000 Uber drivers. There's like 13,000 taxis, and most of them are sort of busy. How many of them? What percentage of them are going to take Uber fares? So it's like it's just the impact will be marginal.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, I think one thing we are seeing from Uber is that, they're touting, I mean, I think maybe because their current business isn't that great, right? Because rides haven't quite recovered. I think prices are up 40% since the beginning of the pandemic, but, the volume of rides that they're doing isn't that great. They've lost market share in Eats on the delivery side, right? So it seems like they are touting a lot of these, more future-y, more kind of growth narrative stories. So, we talked about the taxis, they've announced others. Are there any, that you feel strongly about one way or the other? Any that you like, any that you dislike, the things they've talked about? I mean, one thing Uber has been talking a lot about, and Dara specifically, are the synergies between rides and delivery, both the driver and the customer side. So I'm curious, of any of these sort of future growth narratives, what do you like or what do you not like?
So the whole synergy on the driver's side for rides and Eats is a fiction. It's like 5% overlap. And this, like people who drive people do not want to drive food and vice versa. Yeah. It's just, I asked Tony Zhu about it. It's just not a thing. It's not a synergy.
Yeah, we had a driver at a conference recently on stage with one of Uber's execs. And she basically said, I don't want like a stinky, burger and fries in my car. And then I got to go pick up a passenger after and I get a low rating because of that. Right. So there are some challenges for sure.
It's also a personality type. It's people who like to socialize versus not, people with certain kinds of cars versus others. Like lots of factors. There's no synergy there. Yeah, there is synergy, however, in this notion of what Uber's equivalent of Dash Pass is, which is a loyalty program that ties rides and eats, which is unique relative to Dash. It's super confusing right now, all the rewards. It's hard to tell like what's happening with the rewards program and how you use all these, the points you get for this and that. But I'm sure that's clean. You can clean that up, and I think that is a future thing.
Well, because I mean, I like rides and food because they're the two highest frequency items, right? I mean, you're ordering rides all the time and you're ordering food. And I mean, how big of an advantage do you think it is the fact that, hey, if Uber gives me a discount and I can get all my Uber Eats and all my Uber X at 10 to 20% discount, like, do I really need to use DoorDash? Like, that seems like a big advantage to me. Do you, think that's the case, or can DoorDash just go partner with Lyft and solve that challenge?
If it becomes true that that is a resilience retention tool that helps steal away DoorDash customers, then yes, DoorDash will go do a biz dev deal with Lyft and do the same thing. But I don't know it to be true, but my instinct is there is some value there. I don't know how much.
Yeah.
Because right now they're like, even though DoorDash is in one country, has way more Dash Pass customers than Uber has Uber One customers all over the world.
Yeah.
So we don't know.
Well, I think they've also got a pretty sweet deal with Chase Sapphire Reserve that has gotten them a lot of customers. I know that's how I have my Dash Pass, for example. But interesting stuff. Well, I'll be honest, I could ask you a lot more questions, but I'm sure you've got companies to run and entrepreneurs to mentor. So before we go, though, I want to give you the opportunity, if people want to follow you, where you're active on social media, and as our favorite segment for some people, at least you get to ask me one question that's been burning on your mind for all your years at Uber. I'm sure you've thought a lot about the RideShare Guy.
Well, good. Well, thanks for having me on. My Twitter is at Emil Michael. I would be interested for you to give your grade on Uber management.
I don't think I would give them a D like you did, but I think I would give them, a passing grade, I guess I would say. I think that, like I mentioned, like I've interviewed Dara, I've met him. And, one thing that, we did a driver event in LA, and, we did our little 20-minute on stage interview. And afterwards, I was impressed that, afterwards he stuck around, all his people were trying to usher him out of there, but you could sort of tell he genuinely cared. He wanted to be there, and he was pulling product managers up left and right, like, hey, fix this problem this driver's having. And, they all seemed like a little bit of a ghost look on their face. But I think that, the heart is in the right place for a lot of the management. I think the worry that I have is that, like, a lot of the early, Uber focus was more on the passenger experience. I actually feel like you talked about some of the features and products that you implemented for drivers. Like, I feel like, the origin story of Uber was like, hey, it sucks calling a ride, let's make it better, right? All of the early Uber employees were not drivers. They didn't have experience driving. They got tons of ride credits, and so they're riding as a passenger. So I imagine that impacted a lot of the feedback. And like you said, when you get to 10, 15, 20,000 people, that's like a huge oil tanker going really fast in the sea, and it takes a long time, and it's really difficult to turn that around. So I just feel like a lot of the culture, especially on the driver's side, even though the heart is in the right place, like, I think the actual actions are going to be tough to maybe change some of the perception, where Uber might release some positive features, but drivers have this bad taste in their mouth, or it's sort of like, hey, is this actually good for me? And so, I mean, I guess my grade overall, is definitely, maybe not a D, but, more in the C range, because like you said, like, objectively, like, if you look at the stock price, and that's sort of, kind of how the company has done, I mean, it's done worse than the market. So, I mean, I don't really see how you could look at that objectively and say that they've done a great job.
Yeah. Well, let's hope for better days for drivers and for riders.
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of shares, so I'll definitely be hoping for you, and I'm sure that you're hoping to. I mean, I think there's still a lot of action to be had. It was cool to hear you talk about some of the international companies, and it reminded me that the world is a big place out there, and Uber is a global company. So there's a lot of action and a lot of activity, and I appreciate you coming on, Emil, and sharing all your thoughts.
Thanks, and I will, like, you're a big voice for drivers out there, and it matters what you do. So I'm glad to have someone like you who's got the drive to sort of make them listen. So thanks for that.
Cool. Take care.